I think. Hi, testing. You can hear me now, it sounds like. Turn it up a bit. Okay, well, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Great to see you here in person. Hi to the folks joining online. Great to have you here. Our panel topic today is how bridge builders and peace builders can inform tech design. So as Lisa said, my name is Emma Baumhofer. I work on digital peace building at swisspeace. We are a research and practice peacebuilding institute based in Basel, Switzerland. And I am very excited to moderate this panel with four super panelists here with me today. So I'll start here. We have Colin Rule, CEO of Mediate.com and Arbitrate.com and creator of eBay's dispute resolution system. And then to my right, we have Gehan Gunathilake, who's a human rights lawyer with the University of Oxford. Here next to me on the left, we have Jonathan Gruber. He's a building strategy lead at Einhorn Collective. And then finally, we have Megan Mitchell, who is the chief of staff at New Public. So welcome to all of you. So we're structuring our panel a little bit differently than the previous ones. No PowerPoints or anything like that. We're going to have a conversation and bounce around a little bit. So also to the panelists, I'm going to direct some questions at you, but if there's one that you want to hop in on, just give me a signal and I'm happy to bring you in if I haven't specifically directed it to you. And then I'm just going to give the reminder at the top. We already know the drill now that we have the sticky walls for the questions, but be thinking about these. And also to folks online, please put your questions into the comments because we are going to come back and answer those. And I will invite the in-person people to maybe check the online conversations sometimes too. I know we're here to meet in person, but I think it's really great if we can connect these online and offline communities as well. So perhaps after or later today, you can check those conversations and respond there as well. Okay, so we're just going to get right started, and I asked the panelists to start with a little short introduction so that we can hear more about their work and also specifically what their perspective is for this conversation. So Megan, let's start here and we'll go across.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Okay. I'm Megan Mitchell, Chief of Staff at New Public. Deepti, Doshi was supposed to be up here today, so you get me instead. She's a little under the weather, but New Public is a nonprofit startup focused on designing, researching, and experimenting with design patterns for healthy digital public spaces. So we take a lot of inspiration at New Public from urban planning and the design of public spaces in real life. So, you know, all of us in this room, we have parks, libraries, town squares in our neighborhoods, and we use those spaces to come together to often interact with other people who might be different from us that we wouldn't, you know, interact with socially necessarily. And we're really interested in how we do this online. As we all know, so much of our social interaction now is online, and we're seeing in real time what happens when spaces are designed with advertiser revenue, so engagement, as the North Star rather than, you know, pluralism or social cohesion. And so we're really interested in what would it look like, how could we design spaces for that goal in mind. New Public was founded on a body of research called Civic Signals, which looked at what are the elements of a healthy public space. And we distilled it down to 4 elements. Welcome, it needs to be welcoming. It needs to allow people to connect with one another, to understand each other and their world, and then to understand how to act. And so you think about the UX of a library, for example, it's very simple. You know what to do there, you know what the norms are. Also, the librarian is a very critical role in setting the norms, and so we're really interested in those kinds of public spaces as inspiration for digital spaces, and also really enabling the carers of those spaces, the librarians, to have the tools that they need to create safe and governed spaces.
Hey everyone, great to be with you all. John Gruber with Einhorn Collaborative. A bit of context about what brings me to this conversation. So Einhorn is a foundation focused on addressing the crisis of connection in the US, the overlapping forces of division, distrust, loneliness, and isolation. And we do a lot of work in the bridge building space with the goal of strengthening social cohesion. And one insight that anchors all of our work is the reality that human beings have an innate yearning and capacity for connection. It's our original social technology. Connection's crucial from the very earliest days of life through older adulthood. There's a raft of evidence on the benefits of healthy relationships, on the negative effects of loneliness and isolation. And yet, of course, there's so many aspects of modern life that get in the way of healthy connection, that short-circuit our relational wiring. We've also come to realize that human connection is the active ingredient in so much bridge building work. People need to feel seen, heard, and valued before they can really engage in trying to understand someone else's perspective, before they can be asked to collaborate on shared challenges. I think the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, put it well when he said that relationship is the foundation of dialogue. Right now, it's obviously really hard to create relational spaces online. I think the last panel gave a glimpse of some of the powerful examples of what's possible. But on social media in particular, right, our identities are flattened and also foregrounded, right? And we know from research, Liliana Mason and others, that we're really polarized over identity more so than on disagreements about issues. And online, we're provoked to sort of unleash these negative impulses and emotions and to pounce rather than pause and reflect, let alone to try to repair in moments of rupture, right? So it's not surprising that in our online lives, othering and breaking, right, often win out, right, the opposite of bridging. And that makes this conversation, I think, all the more pressing, right? We've also come to see that so much of the great work happening in the offline bridge building space at a smaller scale is undermined or offset, right, by the experiences that so many people have in digital spaces. The last thing I'll say by way of intro, I'm obviously really interested in this question through my work, but I suspect as for many of you, I feel like I have a personal stake in the matter. I'm a parent to a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I want them to grow into a digital environment that's much more humane and pro-social than the one that they would enter right now. That's a source of anxiety, but also a source of motivation.
Thanks. So it's great to be here. I'll talk a little bit about my research and what I'm doing in Sri Lanka, where I'm from. And I also want to have maybe a couple of ideas thrown out there in terms of global South challenges. And perhaps how tech platforms and tech design need to kind of factor in those differences that we're experiencing in the global South. So my research is essentially on interfaith dialogue, and I'm very interested in how faith groups come together with very different and polarized attitudes on certain issues and try to find common ground. So my research at the University of Oxford focuses on that, and hopefully there'll be a book out next year. But I also work with Search for Common Ground back home in Sri Lanka, and our focus is on gendered online hate speech and cybersexual and gender-based violence. And I think some of the takeaways that I detect from the research that I'm doing both in the UK and in Colombo has a lot to do with a trust deficit that is a little more complicated than what we've discussed so far. So we spoke a lot about trust and agency, and these are really key factors in peace building. The question I want to throw out there is, what do you do when government is part of the problem? What do you do when states actually are part of the problem, both in terms of being mediators that are not trusted by specific actors within the conflict landscape, and I'll talk about Sri Lanka a little bit, and also what do you do when government is part of the driving force that instigates the conflict, right? And Sri Lanka is really important, even though it's a very small market and a very small country. Part of the reason that we're even having this conversation with the tech community is because of places like Sri Lanka and Myanmar, right? It really put us on the map and pushed the agenda in terms of why tech companies need to listen to peace builders. So Sri Lanka has a very complex, multi-dimensional conflict landscape. And I'm not going to go too much into it, but there's a majority community, the Sinhala Buddhist community, which is about 70% of the population. And there are all kinds of dimensions of the conflicts that they would experience with minority communities, including Tamils, Christians, and Muslims. And the problem in this landscape is that the state and the government is often seen as an extension of the majority community's interests. So therefore, you would not want to really have the state as a good faith mediator in conflict. And that poses an additional problem for tech platforms. There's also other dimensions that I'm not going to go into, but there's class dimensions that we're experiencing an economic crisis where student movements are driving a sort of working class struggle against political elites. Once again, the state is seen as representing political elites. There's also a lot of conflict that we're seeing, particularly in the program that I mentioned with Search for Common Ground, where patriarchal and sort of heteronormative elements within society are contesting feminist movements, are contesting sexual minorities. And once again, the state is seen as an extension of the patriarchy and heteronormative values. So the state and government is really not a good faith actor. So now in that context, how do we design tech to rebuild trust with communities? And that's a big challenge, because it's a challenge that really is a challenge that's different to some of the conversations that we might find ourselves having in the West and in the global North, where there is some level of trust in state. And this is all relative, of course, but it is a different conversation. So I just want to pause there, but I've thrown the challenge here, and I'm glad to sort of expand on what my ideas might be in terms of how tech can encounter this challenge.
Good morning, everyone. Ooh, is that too loud? Am I feeding back a bit? Good to see you all. My name is Colin Rule. I'm CEO of Mediate.com and ODR.com. I'm tempted to respond to that point, but I guess I need to introduce myself first. So I come from the field of conflict resolution, conflict management, dispute resolution. I've got very good friends here in the audience from Mediators Beyond Borders International and the National Association for Community Mediation. I was very interested and passionate about peacemaking when I was young, and then I came across dispute resolution, and I said, wow, this is like practical peacemaking. So I tried to learn everything that I could about it, and Mediate.com is sort of a home for mediation practitioners around the world, but we partner with many of our peer organizations. I'm also a founding board member of the Peace Tech Lab at the United States Institute of Peace. I don't know where Sheldon is. He's around here someplace. Yeah, so it's interesting to explore the intersections between these areas. But I would say, from a conflict resolution perspective, a lot of what we're trying to do is build a community of practice and a body of theory and expertise that we can apply to a wide variety of different dispute resolution types. So my particular expertise is in something called online dispute resolution, which has really emerged in the last 20 years. And that's the use of information and communications technology to help people prevent, manage, and resolve conflict. So as was mentioned, I was the first director of online dispute resolution at eBay and PayPal, and we built something called the Resolution Center. And by the time I left in 2011, we were resolving 60 million disputes per year. But as I say, we now run ODR.com. I founded another company called Moderator, which was sold, which primarily works in the courts. But we do a wide variety of different online dispute resolution platforms and designs, from family disputes to workplace disputes to multi-party disputes to everything you can imagine. A lot in the courts, a lot in society, and very international. We have the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. I don't mean to call out all these URLs at you, but it's odr.info if you have your laptop open. That's hosted at the National Center, that's hosted at UMass Amherst. And that's really the home of global online dispute resolution practice. So I can tell you a little bit more about that. Our 21st annual ODR forum is happening in Bangalore in 2 weeks. So we're very excited about that. But so I'm very interested to react. I was also in the Peace Corps in Eritrea, and my heart is really with many of my Eritrean friends. And that's an example of where the government is actually an agent opposed to the interests of the people. So I think I'm eager to engage in this conversation, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for those introductions. We have a lot of super interesting experience to draw on in the rest of this time that we have together. Noted that you have more to say with Gehan. We're going to come back to this point. I think for now, I want to pose my first question actually to both of you, Megan and John. And I'm thinking about this kind of connection between the online and the offline. I mean, you're mentioning using the offline spaces as metaphors for the digital ones that you are creating. And John also looking at understanding how offline bridge building can be relevant for designing online spaces. So maybe can you both talk a little bit more about how the offline informs your work and how it informs in designing digital spaces and products?
we really think of product development, not only the product, but people. And we think we have a lot to learn from community leaders, both online and offline, and I know that's something we share. So what we're looking to do at New Public, a lot of people know us as an organization that thinks a lot about digital space and has great content, and so we're actually moving now into experimenting with design patterns. But what we want to do is, what we're doing is bringing in community leaders who have the lived experience of some of the issues and the harms of tech, but bring them in from the very beginning of the process. So validating ideas, user research, testing, all of that, because we think that they have a lot to say about that, and we have a lot to learn from them, rather than the kind of traditional Silicon Valley process of, a small group of tech developers coming up with an idea and then going eventually to testing that idea more broadly. So we're building something called a Community Stewards Guild, filled with those community leaders, both online and offline, that can really inform our product development process from the start.
One reflection that I'll offer is that I think some of the best work in the bridge building space stokes sort of mindsets and norms that stand in sharp contrast to some of the impulses that are exploited in online spaces. So one example is the power of stoking a sense of curiosity. We've talked a lot about trust as a sort of foundational element in bridging and peace building work. We haven't talked as much about curiosity, right, which is perhaps like a lower bar or a pathway to trust building. And many of the leaders I've learned from in the bridging space are really adept at helping people get past sort of crude assumptions about the other side, which online, right, is like really front and center, again, because identity is so salient and really simplified. It's easy to latch on to those assumptions. And some of the best work in the bridging space helps people get past that and seeing people in all of their complexity and multitudes and messiness, to really get at individual stories, right, not just group identities. One example, StoryCorps, whose work some of you probably know, they're in the midst of a really innovative initiative called One Small Step that pairs people across the political aisle for StoryCorps conversations, right, these open-hearted, personal conversations in one-to-one sort of human scale setting. And one of the things that's so powerful about that is just the simple but profound questions, right, that people are encouraged to respond to, that take a conversation to a different plane and invite curiosity and openness to complexity. It's like, who is one of the most influential people in your life and what did they teach you? What's a formative experience that shaped your beliefs, right? It's not how could you have voted for so-and-so or why do you subscribe to this party's platform, but different types of conversation are made possible by those questions that spark real curiosity. Another insight is that, we've talked throughout today about the importance of shared identity and common goals, which I think is also really crucial in online spaces where us versus them mindsets become so entrenched. It's really hard to then see what you might have in common, even amidst deep disagreement. Some of the best bridging work, again, offline, is really powerful at helping people, even amidst their differences, find common ground and work towards shared solutions. Millennial Action Project, one example. Organization that helps build relationships between young elected leaders in state legislatures and in Congress across the political divide, and who come together through the shared identity of being next-gen, solutions-oriented, but pragmatic problem solvers, who then work together to develop and pass policies around a whole host of issues that benefit the younger generations. An example of really powerful work that's anchored in, again, finding shared identity, defining common goals, and then working together to advance.
Yeah, great points to come back to. I also like this concept of stoking curiosity, putting an underscore under that one. Colin, I'm going to go to you now. First of all, I invite you to respond to Gehan's points earlier if you want, but the question I'm giving to you is maybe you can tell us a little bit more about online dispute resolution, because you've really been working at scale in this area, a bigger scale than probably a lot of the other projects that we're talking about here today. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this evolution, but then also what can we learn from e-commerce resolution, dispute resolution, and how can we use it in other online contexts?
Thank you. It's a great question. I'm not sure if everybody here has a firm grounding in the field of dispute resolution, but the building blocks that we mostly use, one of the things, there was a pioneer in dispute resolution, a guy named Frank Sander, and he talked about fitting the forum to the fuss. And the components that we use in building our systems are often negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and increasingly ombuds. So there are different models for how dispute resolution services can be applied. So online dispute resolution, interestingly, arose because of e-commerce. All these people started transacting in the 90s, and we were saying, well, how are we going to resolve these cases? Because there are people in different locations all around the world. They all come from different cultures, different expectations. So that was why eBay hired me, because I wrote a book called Online Dispute Resolution for Business, and they said, okay, you think you're so smart? Come out and do this. So we learned a lot. And it's not just eBay. The division that I worked at eBay was called Trust and Safety, and I think John's point about trust is very well taken. Trust is a very fragile thing, and it's very easy to lose trust, and it's really hard to build it back. But there's a lot of theory that undergirds the dispute resolution field. One of the things that one of our texts that's oft cited is called Getting to Yes, and one of the things that those authors said is you should focus on the problem, not the person. So a lot of what we did in the e-commerce context was we focused on this high volume of low-value cross-border disputes, and we were able to provide consistent, fast and fair outcomes. And over time, that built trust. It built trust. I remember the first time I told my wife I was going to work about eBay, she was like, so you send money to strangers and you think they're going to send you an item? And I'm like, yeah, it actually works a lot of the time. She said the same thing about Airbnb. So you're going to go stay in somebody's guest room? And how's that going to work? But what we found is, again and again, when you use trust and safety mechanisms like reputation and resolutions, you can build trustworthy experiences, and then people learn over time that they can trust them. But there is some percentage that you shouldn't trust. And at eBay, we found that was 0.1% were the bad actors that would create problems. And you do need to take meaningful action to deal with that volume of cases. Because if you don't deal with the 0.1%, the word is going to get out, and it's going to undermine trust more broadly. So what's been interesting to me is to watch the rise of social networking. And I think it feels to me, and this is something that the Peace Tech Lab, we've talked about this quite a bit, e-commerce went through a Wild West phase. But over time, it was sort of civilized, and we put rules in place that created certainty. It created that level of trust. And I think right now we need to craft new laws, not laws, but rules, regulations, trust and safety policies within these internet intermediaries that incentivize the behavior that builds social cohesion, that builds empathy. And I've done a lot of consulting, for instance, with Nextdoor here in San Francisco, and they had a big problem in the early days, and I think they restructured. Mediation, essentially, if you don't know the difference between mediation and arbitration, mediation is assisted negotiation, where a third party joins the negotiators and helps them find a solution. So we often call that mediation. If it's assisted negotiation, there are ways that technology can also assist negotiation. And negotiation, we all negotiate. We negotiate when we walk down the street, who are not going to, you negotiate with your spouse, you negotiate with your boss. It's the human condition. But the question is, how can we build technology that reinforces what we call integrative, value-creating negotiation and disincentivizes behavior like threats and insults that undermine that social cohesion. So that's happening in ODR at scale. As I say, we're resolving more than 1 billion disputes per year through these mechanisms. And a lot of the approaches we're taking are more transformative. They're more human-centered. They're more relationship building. So that, to me, is the question we can revisit here, is thinking about what can we learn from those tools and apply them in other contexts.
Yeah, thank you. Gehan, I'm going to go to you now. You gave us a little bit of an intro to the context in Sri Lanka, but maybe you can give a little bit more detail about how specifically technology is shaping conflict there and perhaps also peace building. Sure. And then another element to think about is, we're coming from an example of scale, but I also like what Megan was talking about with bringing in different stakeholders when you're building these digital tools. So how do we kind of avoid a two-scaled, one-size-fits-all approach, and how do we kind of keep that local element? Maybe you can help us figure that out.
Yeah, so I think technology is somewhat part of the problem in Sri Lanka and other places like Myanmar as well, because a lot of the problems and a lot of the polarization is amplified on platforms. And that's not something that we need to discuss a lot because that's fairly well understood, it's fairly well accepted. So I just want to talk a little bit about what impact that has on the peace building landscape. And I think part of the problem in places like Sri Lanka is that platforms are not trusted by those who use those platforms. And that's really quite an entrenched issue. Now, states can capitalize on that. Governments can capitalize and say, okay, platforms need to be regulated, and we need to bring in legislation to regulate platforms. And I think in places like Sri Lanka, the conversation on regulation is quite vibrant and often driven by government. Because we've had online, hate speech spreading in Sri Lanka back in 2018 that led to actual physical violence. There was a sort of mini pogrom against Muslims in many parts of the country during that time, and some of the platforms that were used to spread hate speech, they were part of the problem. And then from that conversation came a very, very distinct regulatory initiative and a drive, an agenda. Now, I think if we were to go back to the point I made about the state being a bad faith actor, you certainly don't want a bad faith actor regulating the platforms that are part of the problem, right? So here we are in a real dilemma. We're stuck between two kind of, I don't want to use the word monsters, but in a sense, we have two very problematic spaces that we don't want to trust one and not the other. We don't want to be in a situation where we're reliant on states that are bad faith actors, right? So this is why initiatives that explore non-state forms of regulation have been so important in places like Sri Lanka. And right now I'm part of a project that is trying to get the tech industry to sign on to a code of practice. And this is actually a really important initiative because the tech industry itself is part of that conversation and is driving that conversation. And the tech industry is incentivized to do that because the alternative is tough legislative reform, right? So here we have an interesting opportunity to use a context like Sri Lanka to come up with an alternative to state-initiated and state-driven legislation. So that's a big experimental space. And if it works, I think it's worth replicating. And in Sri Lanka right now, we're trying to replicate a model in New Zealand, and it's a vastly different context. But still, we're trying to say that we'll give non-state regulatory mechanisms a chance before we trust the state with legislation. To go back to the point about making sure that each approach is fit for purpose, I really do think that tech platforms can offer an alternative to state-mediated conflict resolution. And I just want to kind of respond to what we heard about the eBay dispute resolution mechanism. For me, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. Right? We don't need to fear conflict. Conflict is a fact of life. It's going to be there whether we like it or not. It really is much more to do with how we resolve conflict. And if we can get communities that are very strongly entrenched in terms of their identity to experience conflict resolution through alternatives to state-mediated resolution mechanisms, whether it's a dispute in e-commerce or whether it's a sort of low-scale contestation on a social media platform. Whatever it is, the experience of resolving that conflict through a technology that is truly seen as neutral, and I mean neutral in the relative sense. I take the point that nothing is truly neutral, but neutral compared to the state. If you experience that, I think you can start making inroads. Because really, in systems where a person from a majority community relies on, say, a local government official to resolve their dispute with a member of a minority community, that whole experience is already skewed towards the majority community member. But if that same individual goes through the experience of resolving an e-commerce dispute on a platform that is truly attempting to be neutral, I think that there is a potential transformative impact, and it's worth exploring. So more to talk about. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Speaking of more to talk about, I want to open it up. I mean, if anyone has a reflection or a comment on something that's already been said, Colin, you're nodding. Go ahead. And on this side, is there?
Sure.
You want to go
We'll
first?
bring you in.
No.
I just talked. So.
Well, I was just going to comment on the idea of scale, and we're thinking about this a lot. You know, the idea that we could have one public square, a la Facebook, is kind of a crazy idea when all of our communities have, you know, a town square that's specific to our community. And so we're really interested in the rise of federated social spaces, small social spaces like Mastodon, or even WhatsApp groups, Discord servers. And that's what we're really focused on, is how could we make, you know, the UX or the onboarding process of these social spaces better, so that people actually understand what to do when they get there. It's such a new frontier for all of us. But our hypothesis is that the future is really in these smaller social spaces that are more customized to the needs of that particular community, versus trying to sort of force fit a giant platform to so many different types of needs.
Yeah, great points. Go ahead, Colin.
Well, I just wanted to react again on the some of the points that were made about when the government is sort of advancing the interests of one particular majoritarian perspective. And again, I speak most intimately about Eritrea because I know that I don't know if everybody knows about Eritrea here. In the General Assembly at the UN, someone referred to Eritrea as the North Korea of Africa, and North Korea filed a complaint saying, don't associate us with Eritrea, like, you know, so that just gives you a sense. I mean, I was there right after independence, and it was actually a glorious time. There was a lot of optimism after 36 years. At the time, it was the longest war of independence in Africa, and it was over. South Sudan has since surpassed it, which is also sad. But the young people, the students that I taught English in Eritrea, the saying amongst them is leave to live, because it's the only option you have. There's mandatory national service in Eritrea, which is really forced. You know, you have to be essentially unpaid worker for the state for an undeclared amount of time. So people are leaving to try and survive. So when we talk about when the government is opposed to the interests of their people, the interesting thing is, working here in Silicon Valley, I'm having more and more interactions with digital nomads. And these are people who, they declare themselves stateless. Actually, recently it's been a lot of Russians who have said, you know what, I don't want anything to do with Russia, I'm out, and I'm renouncing my connection to the country, and I'm going to build a new identity. And I'm seeing more and more people are starting virtual nations and starting virtual, so we were talking about kind of what does that look like, what does that even mean? And I've spent a lot of time working in the blockchain space, the decentralized finance space. We have an ODR, we talk about something called decentralized justice, which is a notion that you take the nation state, you take the power essentially away from the nation state as the primary actor of building civic institutions. And I think a lot of behavior that you see around the world where nation states are cracking down is a sense that they themselves are losing that power. And I think that there's an interesting opportunity for us to envision what does it mean to be, you know, because you can create communities, as you say. There are minority populations spread around the world, but when you aggregate through technology, suddenly you have a force to deal with, and that gives people a voice. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 20 years, is the internet has given voices to a lot of these voiceless populations that have been systematically oppressed by majority governments that wanted to silence their voices. So how do we embrace that? How do we build a new, essentially, order that can allow these maybe non-state citizens to have a voice and interact, and then maybe get out of these oppressive situations? So again, looking at Eritrea, I hope for change in Eritrea, but I'm not going to put all my eggs on that basket, because Isaias could die finally, and then a new oppressor could snap into place. So I'd like to surface that with the rest of the panel and see what you think.
I want to return to and build on one point that Gehan made about conflict not being inherently problematic. One of the frameworks that I've found really illuminating in the bridging world is the high conflict, good conflict framework that journalist Amanda Ripley introduced in her book High Conflict, that many of you may be familiar with. And she talks about high conflict as conflicts that become all-consuming and self-perpetuating and characterized by rigidity and righteousness and certainty, right? And it's really hard to even figure out any way forward. Whereas good conflict, in contrast, is characterized by flexibility and a sense of complexity and humility, right? And the way out of good conflict, Amanda talks about, is often by slowing things down, right? Getting past the false binaries and bringing the conversation sort of to a different topic outside of the core conflict at hand. And that often helps to reveal what she calls the understory. So there's surface level, what the conflict is ostensibly about. And then there's the understory, which is what it's really about. And she offers a bunch of case examples where sort of the understory gets revealed by slowing things down and introducing more complexity into the conversation. And I think there's an interesting question about how that good conflict frame could show up in the design of digital spaces. So some of the research that Amanda talks about is from Peter Coleman at the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia, who did some really interesting studies where he would bring two people together who are on really opposite sides of a very fraught issue to have a conversation, like say about abortion or gun rights. And when they would have people read an article about the issue from one side or the other before having a conversation, and predictably it sort of stayed at that high conflict kind of place. And then when they had people read an article about a different issue, but that introduced this frame of complexity about that issue. So read an article about abortion that's really complex, multifaceted, humanizing, then have a conversation about the Mideast conflict or about gun violence. People brought the conversation to a much different place and were able to have that kind of good conflict encounter. So it's an interesting question, right, when it comes to the content that gets served up in our news feeds and in digital spaces. How could we put forward more content, right, that actually complexifies both the issues that people are interested in, but also other topics? I think is an intriguing question.
That actually leads into the next question that I was going to ask, so that's a nice segue. I'm thinking about how technology can shape discussions to minimize the risk of threats and insults and escalation, which I think that was a great example of, and I want to pose that to the rest of the panelists. Megan, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think we have that same question. But we are, I guess, for us, the easiest way to distill it down is the library doesn't work without the librarian. So we're really interested in governance tools. So developing tools, features, protocol that can be used across platform that actually empower a community leader to govern their space. I think we've probably all experienced online examples where it felt safe. It felt like someone was in charge, there was an adult in the room, and it was moderated, versus spaces that aren't. And so that's kind of our slice of what we're looking at right now is how to actually really equip community leaders online to govern their spaces in a healthy way.
Can you talk a little bit more about those community leaders? Actually, I think that's a great aspect from New Public.
Yeah, I mean, we are so lucky to have this incredible community. We're working with people such as the Dinner Party, Linden Flowers, Crossroads Church, and others, and bringing them into our process. But we also are working with leaders like people who are kind of hacking Facebook groups, for example, like Main Street Mamas, or some of those other types of groups that have actually used the tools that are available that aren't the platform isn't necessarily incentivized the way that they would want it to be, but they're figuring out how to actually make those spaces safe and healthy and well moderated. One example that's not a Facebook group is called Front Porch Forum in Vermont. So I don't know if apparently there's a 70% uptake of Vermont residents are on Front Porch Forum, and it's highly moderated. It does have advertising as part of its revenue, but it's only local advertising. So there's sort of this symbiotic relationship where the advertising dollars actually supports the community. You're only allowed to post one time a day. And there's a large team apparently of moderators that will take down something right away. So it takes that level of commitment, but we'd love to see a Front Porch Forum in every town. That's kind of our vision.
with Front Porch, one of the things I've found interesting reading about some of the testimonials from people who are on it, like there's clearly these norms that are set and reinforced like through the experience of neighborliness and reciprocity and community building, which like I think that question of how do you actually design and incentivize norms in an online space that differ from what we typically see, and that it's interesting. One of the insights from psychology research on moral elevation, this idea of like observing other people behaving in pro-social ways, creates the sense of goodwill and appreciation and connectedness. And you read some of the testimonials from people on Front Porch, and like clearly people are witnessing acts of goodness and decency that then reinforce that and encourage others to show up in the same way. We have the opposite play out in so many of our online spaces. I think that's one of the distinguishing aspects of that kind of community.
Sounds like also like the pace of things, slowing things down is a big element as well that comes up in a lot of these other initiatives you're mentioning. Either of you have comments or reactions to this? Colin, we'll start here.
Sure. I'm trying to censor myself because I don't want to go on and on. But one of the things we talk about, dispute resolution practices grounded in a lot of social psychology and neuroscience. I loved when we were talking about aspirin and oxytocin. That we spend a lot of time thinking about that. But we also think about game theory, and we think about justice, procedural justice, outcome-based justice. One of the things we talk about in mediation is we talk about reframing. And I think one of the things technology can do a really good job at is reframing conversations. One of the things we discovered at eBay is if you gave a complainant, usually a buyer, an open text window when they filed a dispute, they were often the low-power party. They'd sent their money and they didn't get an item, or they got something they weren't happy with. So they would often engage in threats and insults. And when a seller is confronted with that kind of behavior, they get into a certain oppositional frame, and it's very difficult over the course of a short e-commerce resolution to change that frame. We found that the tone, because we looked at hundreds of millions of these cases, the tone of the first message is highly correlated to whether or not the dispute could be resolved by mutual agreement. So we actually changed the code, and what we did was we didn't give the buyer an open text box. We asked them to diagnose their situation with a very comprehensive set of menus and forms, and we would say, okay, what item has the problem? What's the problem you've experienced? And what solutions would work for you? And they had the ability to really nuance, compose that in a nuanced way. And then we would say, okay, you bought this item from this seller on this day, you have this problem, and you're willing to accept these solutions. Is that correct? And they say, yeah, that's right. But no threats and insults. We kept that out. Now, the merchant is highly incentivized by eBay to make sure that buyer is happy. If that buyer is not happy and they leave a negative feedback, that's going to lead to a demotion of the seller's results in eBay. So we created incentives that made sellers want to take care of their buyers. And we coached them. I wrote the message that we gave to all the sellers in response. I'm so sorry we've experienced this. I'm on your side. We're going to work this out. I take your satisfaction personally. And of course, they would delete that message and write something not as good. But the point is, people respond to incentives. And when we did that change, we saw an increase in resolutions by mutual agreement go up 25%. Now, that's just one example. Because in ODR, we're not just dealing with e-commerce disputes. We do divorce and separation, as I say. We do landlord-tenant. We do medical debt. We do all different kinds of disputes, even multi-party disputes. I was one of the co-founders of something called the Online Public Disputes Project that applied these same techniques to environmental disputes or energy disputes or zoning or cleanup disputes. So I think one of the points that I'd like to make is we also talk about party one and party two are the disputants. A key concept in dispute resolution is the third party. And who is the third party? Is it a mediator? Is it an arbitrator? But is it also the community? They can serve as a repository for norms, and they, like Front Porch, they want to work out problems. They don't have a stake in the outcome of an individual disagreement between two parties, but they do have an interest in maintaining trust and maintaining understanding and maintaining social cohesion. So how do we empower these third parties? How do we surface them? And in ODR, we talk about the fourth party. And we don't talk about AI that much. We do talk a lot about the fourth party. What if technology has a seat at the table? What can we ask the technology to do? Can we ask the technology to make observations and suggest resolutions? Can we ask the technology to, again, maybe not a neutral way, because as we said, we've debunked that concept of neutrality, but in an omnipartial way or in an impartial way, in a fair way, hey, here are some ideas from other conflicts that were resolved. So I think it's about using the tools of technology, and someone described mediation to me as benevolent manipulation. And I kind of like that. But I think technology can be benevolently manipulative as well, and those of us who are third parties, we are the designers of that technology, and we need to think about how that technology can shape the conversations that our users are engaging in. And that's why I brought up the Nextdoor example too. I think it's a powerful, they were dealing with a lot of racial insensitivity, and they used the technology to shape these conversations, and it really, but you know, again, they probably left some money on the table because outrage gets a lot of clicks. But you have to make these choices. You have to create the incentives, and users, we as the designers of the platforms, we design the mazes. And then the people in the mazes, they can only choose to go left or right. And that gives us a lot of power. An algorithm is an opinion embedded in mathematics. And we need to use our influence for that benevolent manipulation to reinforce social cohesion.
I saw you nodding a lot.
Yeah, I'm nodding, and I just want to react to that. And I think, although we talk about neutrality, tech platforms can't afford to be value neutral, right? And I think as much as we tell stories about technology right now, that story is right now negative. And the question is, how do we transform that story to being a positive story? How do we showcase the positive narrative that technology can be for good, can be for resolution of disputes, and how do we showcase that? So as much as I agree that this is about user experience, I also think that in order to make that transition, we need to have a narrative about technology that is positive, right? And that can't be done without the tech platforms and tech companies really getting on board and shedding this idea that we need to be neutral and we just need to be a mirror. I think there needs to be a transition where we see technology as a tool for good. And although I'm going to have to reflect on the terminology of benevolent manipulation, I'm not sure I like that term, but I think I probably agree with you. I do think that the value has to be quite plain, and the value has to be that we're moving towards social cohesion. And this conversation we're having right now between peace builders and technology companies and tech companies is an important conversation, because I think it's also about convincing companies that this is important. Because as far as I can see, the consumer is going to be changing. The consumer is going to be looking for values as well. And perhaps it's a conversation that is going to have a positive market value proposition as well. So ultimately, as far as a person who's studying on Sri Lanka and in places where there's a really difficult, complex conflict landscape, if the conversation starts shifting towards technology being really a space that you can have fair resolution of conflict, not necessarily neutral, but at least fair and impartial, as Colin mentioned, I really think that needs to happen in a context where we reconceptualize and revisit what technology stands for. And unfortunately, technology right now stands for conflict, outrage baiting. I was just talking about doom scrolling with one of my colleagues at the table. That's what comes to mind when the average user thinks about technology. And I think that broader narrative has to be transformed, and that's a difficult struggle.
Thank you so much. That's definitely a takeaway I'm going to take with me from this too, revisiting the, what technology stands for. So we are in our last 5 minutes, unfortunately, of this panel. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I just want to give a minute-ish to each of you for some final remarks, maybe to bring in one last example, or you can use the time however you want. I think we'll start on this side, so you'll have the last word, Megan.
Well, the father of online dispute resolution is a professor named Ethan Katch, and one of his favorite quotes is, "The power of technology to resolve disputes is dwarfed by the power of technology to generate new disputes." And I think that is true. I think we like to think that there's sort of a marketplace for services for conflict resolvers, but there's a much bigger marketplace currently for conflict exacerbators. And I think that we need to think about how we can use these formidable tools that are being put in our disposal by technological innovation for the purpose of resolving disputes and building social cohesion. I think we have unrealized externalities. Conflict is inefficient, conflict is disruptive, conflict, it's upsetting, we see this massive problem with depression in young people in the country, and it's because we've built tools that incentivize conflict, and we are paying the price. So now, I think much like what happened in e-commerce, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think we need to build new civic institutions, and we need to create a marketplace that internalizes those externalities and creates financial incentives among founders, among investors, among governments to utilize these tools to build cohesion, empathy, and connection, as opposed to undermining it.
Yeah, I'm going to maybe leave you with a positive thought for once. And I think we're in a moment in human history where for the first time, really, and this is, of course, I take decades as being a moment, right? For the first time, people with power, people with state power, have no real monopoly over the medium, right? No longer do we rely on the state in terms of our newspapers, our radio, our television. First time there's real democratization, and I use that word cautiously, of course, democratization of the medium. And that's an enormous opportunity, and we're just about really understanding that opportunity. And for people who are working in places like Sri Lanka, that's exciting. That's really, really exciting. And I just want to leave that thought that this is an exciting opportunity to go beyond the state, beyond government, and find our own solutions.
Thanks, Jonathan.
The notion that it's hard to hate up close, I think, grounds a lot of the work in the offline bridge building world, which is anchored in bringing people together in authentic connection. And of course, in our online spaces, we're not that close to each other, right? I appreciated Lisa's comment earlier about the nose-biting distance, right? And that's achievable in certain kinds of online spaces and less so in others. And I think one of the challenges to solve for is to sort of optimize the best of the digital disinhibition effect, right? The lack of restraint that people feel and communicate online. How can we channel what's possible there in terms of people showing up with candor and authenticity and curiosity, and mitigate the worst impulses that disinhibition makes possible? I think that's one of the challenges in the design of public-friendly, pro-social textbooks.
Gehan, I just wanted to kind of emphasize what you said, which is that tech does need to take a stand, and I think that's slowly happening. And I really think that it's about setting expectations. When you log onto Facebook, you don't have a nice, clear kind of message that tells you how to act in that space. I'm picking on Facebook a lot today, but if you do something bad, you might get some of that messaging, but it doesn't. We're not setting people up for success. I mean, this is shaping what it means to be a human being now. I'm the mom of 2 young kids, and I, like to think that I guide them lovingly but firmly, and it's the same, that's what we're trying to do with creating tools, and we really believe we can do that. There are features and patterns and practices that can actually get at the behavior that we know we're capable of and we actually want for our society, but it does require taking a stand that's important.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot in this conversation, and join me in thanking these excellent panelists for this conversation. And I look forward to further conversation online and outside of this format.